Hi, my name is Dr. Ed Glaser. A little on my background. I originally studied mechanical engineering at the State University in New York at Stony Brook. Then I went on to practice mechanical engineering for 2 years. I went back to school to become a podiatrist. And I was fascinated with this machine, the foot, and how it functions. But most of what I learned in school didn't agree with the basic principles of physics and engineering. So I went back into my garage and tinkered for about 15 years. And unbeknownst to me, I had taken a fresh look at how biomechanics works, how biomechanics of the foot functions. So what I'm going to show you is going to cut across the grain of everything you were taught in lower extremity biomechanics. Why look? The reason is, scientific studies have shown that foot orthotics don't work. And I would reference the Pfeffer study, Journal of Foot and Ankle, April of '99. They looked at 5,000 patients in 15 centers across the United States for the initial treatment of plantar fasciitis. 7 different modalities were compared: custom-made orthotics, prefabs, Thule heel cups, felt pads, stretching, Silipost pads. You know what came out the best? Cheap, prefabricated orthotics. You know what came out the worst? Custom-made orthotics from a podiatrist. And not just any custom-made orthotics. They used a lab that's owned by the chief of biomechanics at the California College of Podiatric Medicine in the study. So they did their homework. Well, the study was repeated in the Journal of the American Podiatric Medical Association, February 2001. Mechanical treatment of plantar fasciitis, comparing customs and prefabs. What did they find? No statistically significant difference noted between the treatment groups. In fact, these are their graphs. Customs, prefabs. Now imagine you're an insurance company. Do you see $400 worth of difference between those graphs? Well, neither do the insurance companies. But they did prove quite conclusively that flat hard orthotics are indeed flat hard orthotics. But the study I really like was done in biomechanics in October of 2000. Laurie Tiss and Beth Higbee, both PhDs in lower extremity biomechanics. And the reason this is so significant is these two ladies have one of the best gait labs in the world. In '95, before the '96 Olympics, they came through and turned one of the gymnasiums into one of the most high-tech gait labs in the country. And their interest has been studying foot orthotics. And they write, orthoses reduce pressure, but fall short of biomechanical correction. Now, most of the biomechanics we know comes from Root, Orion, and Weed. They wrote the original text in 1977, Normal and Abnormal Function of the Foot. And they quote Root. In the article, they say, according to Root, during the push-off phase of gait, plantar pressure should be highest under the medial forefoot and hallux. In other words, under the first metatarsal and big toe. In contrast, the orthoses in this study seem to reduce plantar pressure in these areas, actually making the gait cycle worse. So if customs and prefabs are basically the same, you only have 3 choices. You can continue what you're doing. In other words, you could continue dispensing orthotics that are no better than prefabs and calling them custom. Or you can go ahead and switch to prefabs. Why not? Save your patients some money. But wouldn't it be better if we could shift our paradigm? What do I mean, shift our paradigm? What I mean is put together the things that you already know and observe in a new way. I'm not going to show you something here that you don't see every day in your practice. But what I am going to do is I'm going to completely destroy the pillars of traditional podiatric biomechanics, which are casting in neutral position, neutral plaster suspension casting, rear foot and forefoot posting, and cast correction. What I'm going to spend a lot of time on is the subtalar joint. That's the joint between the talus and the calcaneus. And this joint controls the way force passes from the body into the foot and from the foot back into the body. And it moves around an axis in the open chain. The subtalar joint axis, as defined by Root, Orion, and Weed, goes from dorsal anterior medial to plantar posterior lateral. In 3 dimensions, it looks like this. So if you have an axis that's askew to all three planes, the motion around that axis will occur in all three planes. So we get the motions of pronation and supination. Pronation involves dorsiflexion, eversion, external rotation, and supination is plantar flexion, inversion, internal rotation. The first thing I want you to note is that in the closed chain, the foot does not move around an axis. Easy to tell that because if you were moving around an axis, the ground would have to be moving, and unless you're in California, the ground is fairly stable. So we get motions of pronation and supination in the closed chain, that is when the foot's on the ground, by moving the bones in relationship to each other. We're going to take a close look at this subtalar joint, and it's a three-faceted joint. There's a posterior, a middle, and an anterior facet. What I want you to note is that that middle facet sits out on a shelf of bone that extends out the medial side of the calcaneus, called the sustentaculum tali. It sustains or holds up the talus. And it acts as a lever arm. If you want to understand subtalar joint motion, you have to look at the geometry of each one of these three facets. And we're going to begin with the posterior facet. Now, the posterior facet is more or less the shape of a coffee cup. Let's take a look. Can you see that? It's a small section of a cone with the smaller part of the cone pointing medially toward the middle facet. Well, what is the axis of this shape? It's right down the middle. How can you possibly move around this shape? Well, you can slide on it, or you can rotate around it. And in fact, we do both. We rotate and slide. If you rotate and slide, you get what we call a screw-like or helicoidal motion. And that's as far as the literature goes, but it's not far enough. Because although both motions do occur, they don't occur simultaneously. In other words, when you first hit the ground, you're hitting the ground in supination. Plantar flexed, inverted, internally rotated. The head of the talus is externally rotated in relationship to the calcaneus. So the head of the talus is sitting on the anterior facet. So when you hit the ground, the calcaneus is stopped by friction, unless you're in Minneapolis in the middle of the winter, like I was last winter. My calcaneus wasn't stopped by friction. It was so cold, I think I saw a lawyer with his hands in his own pockets. The calcaneus was stopped by friction. The momentum is coming down the leg. It hits this cone-shaped posterior facet. You want to rotate around it, but you can't. Why can't you go around the posterior facet? Because the head of the talus is sitting on the anterior. So you cannot rotate. If you can't rotate, what are you going to do? You're going to slide. In what direction? You're going to slide in the direction of the axis of the posterior facet, which points forward and medial, not accidentally, right at the base of the middle facet. So the first motion that occurs at heel contact is actually a forward medial slide along the posterior facet toward the middle facet. So your center of gravity is moving forward and medial onto the middle facet. And as you put force on this lever arm, what's going to happen? The calcaneus will begin to evert. But the key that unlocks the door is this tiny little anterior facet. If you were to take a coffee stirrer and paste it onto the anterior facet and level it, you would notice that the calcaneus was inverted, in inversion. Inversion is part of supination. How do we hit the ground? In supination. So the momentum of the human body is coming down, hitting a level anterior facet. Will that cause you to pronate or supinate? Neither one. Do an experiment. Get up some speed and run straight into the wall. Are you going to bounce left or right? You'll bounce back. So running into a level anterior facet does not encourage you to pronate or supinate until We slide forward and medial, load the middle facet, begin to evert the heel. As we evert the heel, we tilt the anterior facet. Let's take a look. As you evert the heel, the anterior facet will tilt. And what was happily sitting on this level anterior facet? It was the head of the talus. So suddenly it begins to tilt, and the head of the talus slides down that facet like a kid going down a playground slide. What happens when your kid reaches the bottom of the slide? My kids were this big, they'd say, fall down, go boom. That's what happens. The head of the talus literally falls off the anterior facet and is now free to rotate around the cone-shaped posterior facet. And that's how pronation occurs. And that's why we have a big hole in our foot. There's a great big hole in the middle of your foot called the sinus tarsi. Why would you have a hole in the middle of your foot? So that as you pronate, you can close the hole. It obliterates as we pronate. It's funny, we figured that out when I was in podiatry school. Not we, but someone figured it out and said, there's your answer. We'll stuff things into the hole. And we started stuffing first silastic rubber and then titanium. And thank goodness that fell out of favor for about 17 years until they came out with the giant screw. Take this giant screw and you put it in the hole and it blocks pronation. Blocks pronation. Pronation is an important part of the gait cycle. You don't want to block pronation. You want to control pronation. The talar head slides down this tilted anterior facet. What you're seeing here is a three-dimensional animation of this occurring. Let's look at this from a different angle. The talar head sliding down this tilted anterior facet and falling off. This wasn't a new concept. In fact, if you read Root, Orient, and Weed, they have this in their textbook. Here's the head of the talus sitting on a level anterior facet. Here's sliding down a tilted anterior facet, and here it is disarticulated. What I also want you to notice is this vertical distance. You can change the height of the dome of the talus up to 3/4 of an inch during pronation. So how do we measure limb length discrepancy? From the medial malleolus to the umbilicus? And yet you could have 3/4 of an inch of limb length discrepancy occurring below the medial malleolus. Something to think about. When you put pronation and supination together in all three planes, it looks like this. And here it is, the entire foot pronating and supinating. Why is this so important? How does this affect the way we walk? Let's take a look. Let's see how this affects the gait cycle. We're going to begin the gait cycle with heel strike. And we heel strike in supination. Plantar flexed, inverted, internally rotated. That's why we wear out the outside of our shoe. Patient comes in and says, I'm wearing out the outside of my shoe. I say, good for you. That's a good thing. What I want you to observe is that the axis of the subtalar joint actually exits the foot on the plantar posterior lateral side of the heel, right at the point of heel contact. That's not an accident. That's a brilliant design, which we'll go over in a little while. Well, Root, Orient, and Weed, like all good researchers, decide to make a graph. And arbitrarily, let's put supination on top, pronation on the bottom, and let's define the x-axis as neutral position, which of course represents time. They looked at the subtalar joint during the gait cycle, and here we've isolated the stance phase of gait. And you'll note that we heel strike in considerable supination. Let's combine their graph with the secret life of the subtalar joint that I just showed you. We heel strike in supination. The anterior facet is level. The momentum of the body comes down and hits a cone-shaped posterior facet. You want to rotate, but you can't. So you slide forward and medial toward the middle facet. You begin to load this middle facet and evert the heel. This happens very early in the gait cycle. Then you begin to slide down the tilted anterior facet, and right about here you fall off. What stops us from pronating? What actually stops us is a ligament. There's a spring ligament, or calcaneonavicular ligament, that goes from the sustentaculum tali to the navicular. And the head of the talus lands on it and acts as a shock absorber. It's important to absorb shock. Why? Some studies show we hit the ground with 1.5, 1.25, some up to 3 times body weight. How can you do that? How can you hit the ground with more than what you weigh? In physics, we call it impact or impulse. That means decelerating, slowing down as a function of time. For example, if you run your car into a mile of pillows, you decelerate very slowly. You don't have a lot of impact. Run your car into a stone wall. You decelerate very rapidly. You've got a lot of impact. And what have we covered the Earth with in the last 50 years? We've covered the Earth with concrete, which is a very high impact surface. Luckily, the spring ligament doesn't have to do it alone. During pronation, you bend the ankle, the knee, the hip. You use the entire lower extremity as a big shock absorber. If you don't absorb the shock in the lower extremity, it gets transmitted up the kinetic chain, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the lower back, the intervertebral discs. The question is, why do we go through this gyration 10 to 15,000 times in a day? Well, let me point out one of the great observations of Root, Orion, and Weed. They noticed that when the foot was supinated, when the arch was high, the foot would lock. And when the foot was pronated, it would unlock. Well, why do you want your foot to unlock soon after you hit the ground? The reason is Earth is an irregular surface. Every time you hit the ground, you don't know the shape of the terrain. So if you didn't have the ability to unlock your foot and become a mobile adapter or adjust to the shape of the terrain, every time you hit a clump of grass, you'd sprain your ankle. We'd have nothing but BAPS boards everywhere. This would be great for business. But that's not what happens. What happens is we adjust to the shape of the terrain. Then as body weight passes over the foot, we relock the foot to make it a rigid lever for propulsion. That lever has its axis at the ankle. And you're pulling on one side of the lever with the gastrocsoleus tendon, the Achilles tendon. And that creates a rigid lever for propulsion. So because the Earth is an irregular surface, every time we would hit a clump of grass, we'd sprain our ankle. We need this mobile adapter mechanism. But understanding the locking mechanism is really the key to understanding why people develop so many foot, ankle, knee, hip, and back problems. Now, Root, Orion, and Weed took a stab at it. Page 80, they write, parallelism between the long axes of the two articulations of the mid-tarsal joint increases total mid-tarsal joint range of motion, and obliquity decreases mid-tarsal joint range of motion. Let me translate that to English. What they're saying is, in front of the subtalar joint are two joints, the talonavicular and the calcaneocuboid. Together, those two joints make up the mid-tarsal joint. And what they're saying is each one of those two joints has its own axis of motion. And when those axes become parallel, you can get motion occurring. And when the axes go askew, no motion occurs. And this is what's taught in biomechanics, in podiatry school. You'll see it in chiropractic as well as physical therapy. And it's completely ridiculous. Why? You only need to open a talonavicular joint and look to see that it's round. In fact, Serafian, who wrote Functional Anatomy of the Foot and Ankle, calls this joint the acetabulare pedis, the acetabulum of the foot, the ball and socket. Back in 1930, a French anatomist named Capanghi did a beautiful diagram of the ball and socket nature of the talonavicular joint? Well, what do we know about a ball? Any axis that goes through the center of a ball is a valid axis for that ball. So the talonavicular joint, being a ball and socket, has an infinite number of axes. So whatever the axis is going to be at the calcaneocuboid joint, it will always find a parallel axis at the talonavicular. So the idea of axes going askew is ridiculous. So what is the locking mechanism? It's what I already told you. When the talar head slides down the anterior facet and falls off, you can now rotate around the cone-shaped posterior facet. It's a bony block. It's like falling off a cliff. Well, if you can understand that, you'll understand why so many people develop foot, ankle, knee, hip, and back problems. Because the vast majority of your patients and the vast majority of you watching this are pronators. In fact, there was a study done in Belgium that was presented at the John Weed Foundation meeting where they showed 95% of all people pronate excessively. 1% were ideal, and 4% didn't pronate enough. We call those the supinators. Well, how does the pronator walk? The first thing I want you to note is that the pronator generally heel strikes in less supination. What does that mean? It means that the anterior facet is not level. It's already tilted. So the momentum of the human body is not coming and hitting a level facet. You're not running straight into the wall. You're hitting a tilted facet. When you run into the wall at an angle, you bounce off at an angle. So what happens is you pronate earlier, faster, and deeper than you should. You try to recover, but at mid-stance, when the body weight is coming directly over the foot, instead of being near neutral position, you're coming over a pronated or unlocked foot. Now, coming over a pronated or unlocked foot 10 to 15,000 times a day creates biomechanical deformities that we call diagnoses. Let me make a distinction for you between a diagnosis and a symptom. You know what a symptom is? A symptom is when it gets bad enough, you're willing to pay money. So I had to ask myself, why is it that so many people pronate? Why do we end up, 95% of us, over pronators? There are many reasons. It could be that you have a genetic laxity of ligaments in your body that's allowing the foot to collapse. Maybe it's gravity working on you over time, your foot getting flatter and flatter. It's the hard surfaces that we are forced to walk on, concrete. Maybe it has to do with the way we live. Some of us have sedentary lifestyles, so the muscles become weak and they don't support the arch. For some of us, it's trauma. We get into that car accident, we push against the pedals, and we stretch the plantar fascia. There are a whole lot of other lower kinetic chain deformities that can contribute to excessive pronation. But one of the things that I think is the major contributor is the way we develop. Let's take a look at the embryology of foot development. Embryologically, the limb buds emerge from the caudal embryo about 4 to 6 weeks after conception as little paddles about in the frontal plane. They begin to rotate toward the sagittal plane. At one point in development, you're plantar to plantar right in the mid-sagittal plane. Then we begin to rotate down to the transverse plane. At birth, you're at 45 to 55 degrees of inversion in relationship to the ground. But we don't have to walk at birth. We have 9 to 15 months to continue developing. At 3.5 years old, you've reached 90% of your adult position. At 5.5, it's over. You're in your adult position. It could be that many of us don't make it. The foot is rotating down to the ground and it stops in an inverted position. So what does this mean? It means at mid-stance, if the foot is still inverted relative to the ground, there's only really 2 ways you can get that forefoot to the ground. Firstly, You could collapse the arch. You could pronate the foot. Why not? We're already set up to pronate with every step. It's a normal part of the gait cycle. Why not just pronate earlier, faster, and deeper? And that's what we do. Most of us will pronate excessively. We'll collapse our arch. Door number 2, we could lower the head of the first. There wasn't a good word for that position. So we decided to call it MAS, Maximal Arch Subtalar Stabilization. Because what you're going to see is that when we capture that position, we're capturing the maximum arch available to the patient at mid-stance, when the body weight is coming directly over the foot. What does that mean? It means that the talus is externally rotated. The head of the talus is resting on the anterior facet and cannot rotate. Therefore, when the center of gravity passes the heel and you go into heel lift, in the sagittal plane you have a rigid lever to propel you forward. That's what the MAS position is. That is lowering the head of the first. So what is neutral? Let's see where it came from. Root and Weed defined it as neither pronated nor supinated. What kind of definition is that? Then they said, well, we can palpate talonavicular congruity. We're looking at neutral subtalar position, not talonavicular position. And then they said, well, we could take the calcaneus and move it 1/3 into eversion and 2/3 into inversion. We'll find that 2/3, 1/3 position. Again, kind of a lame definition. Where did it originally come from? It was derived from an article written by Dr. Wright in 1964. Subtalar position, where he looked at 2 subjects standing in relaxed standing foot posture. And that became neutral position. That became what we were all shooting for. Isn't that interesting? When I was in school, the seniors taught the juniors. My senior pulls me aside one day in orthopedics. He says, I'm going to teach you all of podiatric biomechanics in 1 sentence. I said, what is it? He said, cast them in neutral and make an orthotic. No matter what you measured on your biomechanical exam, it was always cast them in neutral and make an orthotic. I'm going to show you that neutral is not the right position. This neither pronated nor supinated. What is that? That's like asking, where's Chicago? Well, it's neither New York nor Los Angeles. Where is it? That's not a very effective definition. The real problem with neutral is it doesn't address the goals of biomechanical correction. What are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish with a foot orthotic? We would like a foot orthotic that raised the arch so that at mid-stance, the midfoot is stabilized in the sagittal plane so you can have a propulsive gait. We'd like a foot where the forefoot doesn't influence the rear foot. That is, both the forefoot and rear foot are on the ground. We'd like a foot that as you come over it, 60% of your force is under your first metatarsal because it's designed to handle it. We would also like a foot where the first metatarsal phalangeal joint was free to move, allowing you to have a straight ahead propulsive gait. Those are the goals of biomechanics, and neutral position does not accomplish that. So what about neutral position as a reference point for assessing rear foot and forefoot relations? The fact is, you have to use the floor as a frame of reference. The maximal arch height, the maximal arch subtalar stabilization position, lowering the head of the first, puts the forefoot and the rear foot flush on the floor with the maximal amount of supination available at mid-stance. So there's no need to take any measurements. You're going to take that foot and pass weight through it in as close to an ideal gait cycle as that patient can tolerate with their anatomy, giving them the most functional gait cycle that they are currently capable of handling.